This is 9/11 Freefall.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of 9/11 Freefall. I am the host, Andy Steele. I'm doing another solo episode tonight. Unfortunately, I had a guest scheduled, but he had to cancel. I didn't have time to get another one, but that is okay. There's a lot of stuff to go over, and I also thought it'd be a good opportunity to do something I've been wanting to do for a little while, a chance to sort of look back and see where we've been over the past 3 years. I'm going to be going over some classic clips from old shows, things that I consider to be a classic. I guess I'm the one that designates them a classic, but they're interviews that stuck out in my mind. And I'm not going to be playing the entirety of the interviews, but I'll be going over them and what I consider to be some of the best sound bites from the 3 years that this program's been on the air. Can you believe that I've been doing 9/11 Freefall since 2012, and here we are, 2015. Just hair's getting a little bit grayer, and I think we've come a little bit further, though, as a movement, as AE 9/11 Truth. We've gotten a lot more exposure in that time, and I just see it when I talk to people about this issue. How many people are waking up to this? How many have had their eyes open? How less taboo this topic has been made? And the people in the corporate media establishment system that's kept this issue under wraps all these years, they're losing their power. All right, it's just like that song says, the land of confusion. You know, Superman, where are you now? What is it? Men of skill, men of power are losing control by the hour. I guess I should have the full quote down before I decide to say it on the air, but there's a quote that goes something like that, and it is so true when you look at what's going on right now. How many people are looking at the world in a completely different way, and I really believe a lot of it centers from this topic that we talk about every week, the controlled demolitions of the Twin Towers and Building 7, the evidence that proves we are being lied to, that there's a massive cover-up going on. And so we are chipping away at the official story, but when we chip away at the official story of what happened to the buildings in New York, not only are we decimating that myth that's been sold to us, that official lie that they use to cement their stranglehold over the American people, NIST and the various bureaucrats and officials that have come into power over the years. But we're also chipping away at the overall myth of America, this notion that what goes on in national foreign policy, what goes on in our name as Americans all over the world is being done for the right reasons. Now, it's always been sort of acknowledged that everyday villainy goes on, but people are waking up to the bigger villainies too. And 9/11 is a starting point. It's the springboard from which people dive into much bigger issues. And there's various opinions on what the problem actually is, what we should do for a solution. But the fact that people are talking about this, the fact that people are coming out in droves and becoming more active, becoming more grassroots conscious and organizing, is a good thing. And I know for me, 9/11 started it, and for a lot of other people, that's the case too. So, man, we have come a long way. And this show, 9/11 Freefall, has existed for only 3 or so years, probably a little over 3 years. 9/11 Truth has existed for a lot longer than that. I was involved in 9/11 Truth from as far back as 2006. So look at how far we've come, and look at how the tone is changing. Yes, the media mouthpieces all, a lot of them still sound the same. Not all of them, I shouldn't say, but some of them do, and we'll be going over an example of that tonight. But overall, the general public, people are willing to look at this now in a more open-minded light. And we have you to thank out there, the average person, taking your time every little bit out of the day to either forward a story on your social media, to hand out flyers on street corners when you can, to call talk radio and talk about this issue. All of those efforts are coming together. And the form that our efforts are going to take, the reward that we're going to get from it, I don't know how that's going to manifest. I don't know if we're just going to see one day a huge acknowledgement of what happened on that morning, 9/11, what really happened, or if there'll just be a sudden change in how America does business, or even a subtle one. I see it manifesting, though, all the time in terms of how people interact with their government officials. And I guarantee if anyone tries to orchestrate a cover-up like we've seen with 9/11 again, or if it even crosses their mind, they're going to think about you out there in the listening audience. They're going to think about the people like Richard Gage going around the country talking about this for several years, founding this organization. And they're going to be worried about the next Richard Gage. They're going to be worried about the next 9/11 truth movement, the next truth movement for whatever event they want to orchestrate. So, good for you, good job, and again, tonight we'll be going over some of those old interviews, some clips that I think really stand out in my mind. I know they stand out in my mind. I think they'll stand out in yours too after you listen to them. Before I do get to that, though, I want to go over some news from AE911truth.org. This is regarding an event that has already happened, so I'm going to be talking about it in the future sense as I read the article, but it's already taken place. It ended well. AE911 Truth to inform 100 civil engineering students. And it begins, tucked in at the start of our Northeast film premiere tour of firefighters, architects, and engineers expose 9/11 myths is an historic teaching and debating opportunity that we just couldn't pass up. A mathematics professor at the New Jersey Institute of Technology has invited 2 representatives of architects and engineers from 9/11 Truth to address students and faculty from the school's civil engineering department in a technology, art, and science forum titled 9/11 Critical Questions. The 90-minute event will be held on Wednesday afternoon, November 11th at the New Jersey Institute of Technology's campus center ballroom in Newark, New Jersey. Professor J. Kaproff, Ph.D., created 9/11 Critical Questions in order to present various perspectives on the destruction of the third World Trade Center tower known as Building 7 to 100-plus students and faculty from the university, John A. Reif Jr., Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. So here you go, a major university hosting a debate and question and answer session revolving around our issue, 9/11 Truth, 9/11 Science, the destruction of the buildings in New York. Just to show you that we're coming a long way here. He is also inviting the students and faculty from the New Jersey College of Architecture and Design and from 5 other colleges within that university to attend the forum, and will be placing an article and an advertisement in the school-wide newspaper for that purpose. Now, this is what Professor Kaproff said. He says, I created this forum because I feel strongly that the information about 9/11 that has been publicly distributed by the government and the media up to now is extremely incomplete and has many self-contradictions. We need to reopen the conversation. And that's the way it needs to be approached. It needs to be as a conversation, not as a screaming match. And I love when we have these debates, and I love when they happen in a civil way, because that is the only way that you're going to get to truth. Shouting each other down is going to get nothing in return. It's going to achieve absolutely zilch. All right? All it's going to do is create bad feelings, make people defensive, and instead of trying to come to some kind of reality, some kind of shared understanding based off of facts, people are just going to try to guard their side, try to cut down the other one. That is the politics and debate of Fox News. That is the politics and debate of MSNBC. That is not something that we want to carry on into the future as we move forward in the 21st century. The discourse in this country that began this century has set us off on the wrong foot. Right? But rather than staying on that path, business as usual, we need to correct the course and make as much out of this century as we can. We need to be more logical people. We need to actually look at the reality in front of us, acknowledge it, and discuss it, even if people have differences of opinion. I had a guy on here half a year ago who doesn't agree with me, and we debated, and it was a nice discussion. He was a nice guy. Right? That's the way it needs to be handled. Not this shouting down, people yelling at each other from two different boxes on the TV screen. Need to end that. That's how things like 9/11 are allowed to be covered up, how these kinds of crimes can be committed. Because you get some nice professor who is looking into the information, has the facts on his side, versus some blowhard loudmouth that just shouts them down, appealing to people's lower brains. And, it just shuts down the conversation. We don't want any of that. Just going back to the article, Capriff invited two speakers from AE 9/11 Truth, founder and CEO Richard Gage, an architect, and Tony Zambodi, a mechanical design engineer, whose presentations he had heard at other venues. This is what Capriff said. I was impressed by their detailed knowledge of the World Trade Center destruction and thought that if they could present their ideas at an engineering school, we would have a chance to show, through reason rather than emotion, what was not covered properly in the official story. To ensure coverage of the issue would not be one-sided, Capriff also reached out to participants in and sympathizers with the official investigation of World Trade Center 7, which was conducted by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. But when he received no response from them, he arranged for members of the university's civil engineering department to create a panel to present their view of the events and to question the AE 9/11 Truth speakers. So basically it was a debate-style arrangement, as the article goes on to say. And from what I gather, without having the specifics in front of me, from what I've just heard from Richard, I guess it went very well for AE 9/11 Truth. Very few people, and there were something like 70 people, I want to say, that were in attendance there. Only a couple of them was still buying the official story after the debate went on. And these were not preaching to the choir presentation either. These were people that were on the fence, people who had no dog in this fight whatsoever. What happens many times, you get this information in front of an audience, and the audience generally ends up agreeing, most of them. Because real investigation is the most reasonable thing that anybody can ask for. Again, without having to commit to a single side, let's just reinvestigate. Let's acknowledge the problems with the official story and address them. That is all AE 9/11 Truth is asking for. But if you ask some people in government, some people in the media, that is out of bounds. We can't allow them to simply ask for that. The irrationality on the other side, the knee-jerk reactions to these simple questions raised by AE 9/11 Truth, shows just how hollow their positions are there, how afraid they are of any real inquiry into this event. So, if you don't like conspiracy theories, quote unquote, then agree to a new investigation. That will get rid of them overnight. So good job there, and at some point I'm going to get Jay Capriff on this program to talk about what took place there in New Jersey, go into a little bit more details about the debate, and maybe we can even have another one at some point. If this new university in New Jersey had this event, we've set precedent. The sky didn't fall on them. Nobody has done anything to this university. There's been no negative consequences that I know. So right there, the gates are open. Let other universities do it too. They can look to New Jersey Institute of Technology as an example. All right, the other article I wanted to go over today is from Mr. Alex Beam from the Boston Globe. His article is called "The Truthers and 9/11." And he begins it saying, "I have a somewhat romantic view of architects. They seem to be generally smart and well-educated and ply their trade at the intersection of art and craft. In movies, they are always well-groomed, sashaying around their tastefully designed studios, making insightful observations. So imagine my surprise to learn that the architect truthers, a tiny vocal subset of the profession that insists the U.S. government is hiding the truth about the destruction of the World Trade Center towers and other events." So he's implying that just the notion is so out there that, I used to have such respect for architects, but then I found out that some architects question the official story of what happened to the towers. So I was so surprised. Then he goes on, "San Francisco-based architect Richard Gage is the founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth and will be speaking here next week at ABX, an annual trade show produced by the Boston Society of Architects." He goes on and talks about the video by Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, the one starring Ed Asner, 15 minutes solving the mystery of Building 7. And then speaking of Asner, Mr. Beam writes, it's hard to understand how Asner, an early 9/11 truther who has suggested that investors profited from 9/11, or the running gag line that is Geraldo Rivera also featured in the video, add up to the group's credibility. So they're going after Asner. We're not using the Geraldo for our credibility, Gage told me. We're using our appearance on mainstream media to gain credit for our cause. He also goes on to talk about Lynn Margolis. And then they go on to rehash this attack attempt by saying Gage struggles to gain credibility within the architectural profession. And he cites the president of the American Institute of Architects, saying that the 3-year-long government-financed National Institute of Standards Technology investigation into the building's collapse is valid and credible. And obviously, the credibility of the AIA at this point and some of the arguments that were raised at that business meeting during the convention this year when the debate on the Building 7 resolution really calls into question their own knowledge base on this topic. People go up there and just state flat-out false information that the U.S. government doesn't even support. Completely uninformed. So the fact that they have that they are the AIA and they have the logo and the title by their name doesn't necessarily mean that they're being upfront, truthful, or that they even know what they're talking about when it comes to this issue, that they've researched it even all that deeply. You'd like to think they did before they stood up and opposed the Building 7 resolution, that they actually knew their stuff, but listening to some of these things that were said, talking about the diesel fueling the fires when even the government doesn't stand by that story, really makes you question their authority on any of this. Certainly their authority to talk about what happened to Building 7. So the article continues. Gage won't say, I want you to pay attention to this. This is another common attack that corporate media will do. Gage won't say who he thinks sabotaged the Trade Center buildings, but his adherents are not so shy. So Richard basically told this guy the same thing that we say on this show. We don't get into complicity, pointing fingers. We stick to the scientific method. We stick to what we can prove. But that wasn't good enough. He couldn't get what he needed out of Richard in this interview. So he says, at an event he organized in 2012, one 9/11 truther said, I had to be dragged kicking and screaming into believing that our government and the Israeli government, the Israeli Mossad, could be responsible for the Twin Towers demolition. So they found some guy who happened to go to an AE 9/11 Truth event, who had an opinion back in 2012. Okay, that's 3 years ago. I was talking about how long this show has existed. At the time I was starting this show is how far back they had to go to find somebody for a quote to use to try to attach us to the blame Israel stuff. And I'm not making an opinion on that whatsoever, other than that AE doesn't get into complicity for a very specific reason. Because reporters will do this. They'll set up straw mans. They'll find one person who believes some crazy thing about 9/11. So they'll find some nutcase that says space aliens did it or something and quote that person and say that's representative of 9/11 truth. Because this one person that we interviewed said that. That's what all of the 9/11 truth people think. And look, he had to go back to 2012 to find this person. To find some quote. All right. The fact that they're willing to go back that far to do that means that they're looking for some kind of soundbite, or in this case a quote, to put in there to confuse everything, to get the blaming Israel stuff in there so that you might have some Jewish readers who say, oh, that's terrible, how dare they, and get caught up in that whole emotional aspect of it rather than just looking at the hard science. All right. Another attendee reported at least 3 firefighters in New York at Ground Zero who came up on a large store of gold at the Twin Towers were executed by the FBI. So issues having nothing to do with what we talk about being brought up to muddy the waters. Then Richard goes on to say, we'll let the chips fall where they may as to who perpetrated these acts. We're not journalists who should be following the money in this massive crime. That's for you as a journalist to follow up. So Richard did everything right in talking to this guy, but this guy was just determined to find some quote somewhere. Folks, look. I could do that with any issue. Let's say you had a group out there that is for single-payer health care. Now, I could probably find, if there was some group out there advocating for this, I could find some guy out there who is a raging communist who thinks that we should have a Politburo in the United States, who happens to support this group, and I should ask him, well, how much government control do you think we should have? And he would give me his gas, and I could publish that and say that is representative of the group. When most people who are for single-payer health care, regardless of how you feel about it, I'm not going to say that they're communists. I mean, that's just an opinion. That's an opinion on politics, right? That just happens to be their opinion. Or you could go towards the right. I could find somebody who is for a particular issue, maybe immigration control. There might be a group that's for having stronger immigration laws, and find one person who's just a diehard racist, member of the KKK, and quote him and claim that that is representative of that entire group. That's how this stuff works. You can always find somebody. In a country of 300 million people, you can always find somebody to make the point you want to make and paint a picture of a group that you want to portray to your audience. It's like History Channel does this. I've laughed my butt off watching them viciously attack people that question the official story of 9/11. They will put on their dignified expert hats, pretending that they have a real opinion on this, and act as the authority. But then at the same time, they'll run 8 hours of Nostradamus. And then some of the claims that they will make up stuff. They will make up stuff trying to justify all of this goofy stuff that they put on there by saying some people claim. Now, when you say some people claim, if you can find one person who claims that, well, you can make that claim yourself. If I came on this program and said that I think that the moon is made of Swiss cheese and giant moths control the universe, if I came on here and said that, another person could say, well, some people claim the moon is made of Swiss cheese and giant moths control the universe. All right, some truthers claim. It's a way of not technically lying, but being able to deceive the general public. It's absolutely ridiculous, absolutely underhanded. And honestly, I used to get upset when I read stuff like this from these corporate media hacks like Alex Beam. But now, at this point, it's just kind of like that line from JFK. You can't blame pigs for oinking. This is what they do. This is their bread and butter. This is how they survive. All right? The corporate media isn't necessarily known in this day and age for being bold and sticking its head up when it's right to do so. You don't survive that way, doing that. So, you can read that article on the internet if you want to. If you want to respond to Mr. Beam, there's a comment section there on the page for you to leave your comments. Let them know what you think about this here article. But people like Alex Beam and all these other corporate hoo-has that put out this information are really just marginalizing themselves. They're cutting themselves out of the new world that's being created, that's forming without them in it. Because, again, corporate media, government doesn't necessarily have the credibility that they used to 10 years ago. These tricks don't work. Nobody listens anymore. This has happened in other countries throughout the ages. The media starts to sound more like propaganda, and governments continue lying. People just turn them off. People just talk amongst each other. And that is the first step towards revolution. When I'm talking about revolution, I'm not talking about shooting and bombs and all that kind of stuff. Revolution is a change in thought, a change in the way the public thinks. And in this case, waking up to the controlled demolition evidence regarding 9/11, the buildings in New York, is a revolution in thought. Seeing what is right in front of you, not just buying an impossible story because the TV tells you that it's true. Not just turning a blind eye to all these experts, pointing out the impossibility of the government's official story because the government decides to ridicule them. America is becoming above that. America is rising above all of this lies and deception. And we have you to thank out there in the audience, all of the great people in the 9/11 Truth Movement. America is becoming a better place. So even if you don't think we're ever going to get a new 9/11 investigation, if you don't think that day will ever come, I think it will, but if you don't, at least we're having a three-dimensional effect in our impact on public perception and public attitude, and we're making America a better place. I really believe that. All right, before I start playing interviews from the best interview clips, we're going to do what we do every week. We're going to take 10 seconds of silence to remember the victims of 9/11 and their families and all the people who died in the wars that followed 9/11. We'll do that beginning now. And that's 10 seconds.
The views expressed on this show by guests and the host on issues outside of the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence are the opinions of those individuals alone and do not necessarily reflect those of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth.
All right, this first clip is from January 24th, 2013. I was interviewing retired California Highway Patrolman, police officer John Metters. And this was right after AE 9/11 Truth sent out a fax to every police chief and sheriff in the United States outlining the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence. And I asked John about the obligations of a police officer when they hear about new evidence in a crime, particularly a murder. And what is the officer obligated to do? Listen in on John's answer.
That's amazing. That's the first time I actually heard that element of that story from you. Let's talk about procedure. Let's pretend that you're not retired and you're still on the California Highway Patrol.
Okay.
And forget about 9/11. Let's just say that I come up to you and say, Officer, I have critical information about a bunch of murders that took place back in New York back in 2001. Now, I say that to you as an law out there in California. What are you obligated to do in that scenario?
I'm obligated to investigate myself, put you in touch with someone that can investigate it and will investigate it, and also follow up and make sure that an investigation did take place.
So, I mean, how would you do that? You just you just look. Would you look for somebody in New York in that jurisdiction, or?
Well, procedurally, I would take these steps, Andy. I would look at this person credibility-wise. I mean, after you're a street cop for a while, you understand almost immediately whether someone's what we call a 5150, someone who's a half bubble off, who doesn't have a full stack. And I would determine if this person is actually credible. And at that point, I would look at some of his evidence myself, if he has some with him. But if he doesn't, I would take this guy to someone, either the sheriff's department, because they generally handle all the murder cases, or the police department in that jurisdiction, and put him in contact with a detective or someone who can follow up and go out of state to take a look at this, or at least contact another police agency to start an investigation. And I would make sure that it would follow through. I mean, that would have to be your answer as a street cop. You have to make sure that this is someone is sinking their teeth in it, and it doesn't fall, through a crack in the woodwork or something.
Okay, so it's basically, so even if the murder has been tried and somebody's already gone to jail, but somebody who, let's say they have some credentials to them and has investigated this and they've got new evidence that maybe the went to jail, didn't do it. So you're obligated to follow through on that and make sure that there's some action on this.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, legally you are, yeah.
Legally you are, okay. So now let's rewind here. Let's propose the same exact scenario, but in this case it's 9/11, which is widely known about by everyone. What changes in this scenario?
Nothing. What changes? No, we have a duty. You're putting me back in the scenario. I'm a beat cop. I am an on-duty cop. I'm not retired. There's really nothing that changes. And I guess that's what bothered me so much when I woke up to it. I said, 3,000 American citizens are dead. We need to do something about it. Andy, I'm going to tell you, I was so upset when I found out that I was right about this, that I used to wake up and think about ways, how do I approach the people I know to get in touch with the authorities in New York to tell them that, hey, this thing is not what it seems to be. I used to go through scenarios in my head. I used to say, well, maybe if I offer in brief, and at that time I was an acting sergeant, and I said, well, maybe I offer the officers $100 to disprove what I'm saying. Would that get people to start looking at it or something? I was very perplexed by the whole thing when I found out about it.
I can tell just from the sound of your voice. So just to reiterate, I don't want to keep beating this horse, but let's say I and Richard Gage walk into the sheriff's office and we say, hey, the guy that went to jail for the crime, or the guy who was accused of the crime may not be responsible, or there's some other element in it. So they're basically obligated to look into the crime and like as we say in the letter, to forward it through their proper channels and make sure that this evidence is acted on.
Yes, exactly. I mean, you're dereliction of duty if you don't.
This next clip is from an episode that aired on December 12th, 2013. I was interviewing a legal expert, John Remington Graham, and we were talking about his work with AE 9/11 Truth when they were petitioning the Manhattan DA's office, Cyrus Vance's office there, for a grand jury investigation of 9/11, and the response that AE 9/11 Truth got from Vance's office, which claimed that 9/11 somehow fell out of its jurisdiction. So go ahead and listen.
Now, last week I spoke about a story, I guess it was a year or a couple of years old, about a gentleman who was supposedly plotting to blow up synagogues in New York, and he was prosecuted under New York State's anti-terrorism laws that were passed after 9/11. Now, I want you to comment on this because I commented on it, but I'm just speculating. I don't know the law very well, but just under this law, forgetting all the other things you cited.
You probably couldn't have prosecuted under that if they were passed after 9/11. It would be an ex post facto law if it were prosecuted. But before 9/11, New York had laws that would cover cases of this kind. Laws on murder, manslaughter, arson. And most states have laws on terrorism. Minnesota had when I was prosecuting, we had a statute on terroristic threats. We prosecuted under that all the time. It was very common, so there was no problem. The state of New York could have prosecuted.
That's what I thought, that under that specific law that it might not apply simply because 9/11 happened before, but there are so many avenues with which to go after this and investigate it and prosecute it that I find it hard to believe that Cyrus Vance's office, if they really wanted to, couldn't find a creative way.
The only reason they're not is that they don't want to. And that they don't want to because this is politically too hot to touch.
Now, by wrongly citing, as you're saying, that they have no jurisdiction, is there any kind of, other than ethical and moral crimes being committed, is there any kind of dereliction or duty or crimes taking place?
Well, when I was a prosecutor, it was claimed that I was derelict in my duty in prosecuting cases of criminal sexual conduct. When I was prosecuting child abuse and sexual abuse of children or adults were hot button items, and people get very, very excited about that. Because my office was prosecuting 2/3 more of this kind of crime than my predecessor was, who was considered some kind of an expert in this field, and we were prosecuting a lot more, I had to be much more careful about reviewing the evidence. And there were times when individuals who were clearly innocent were being railroaded. And I remember one case where a man was being prosecuted for raping a child, I think 3 years old, and the key evidence was bruises on the insides of the thighs of this little girl. And I had three groups had this examined by. There were three doctors of medicine: a pathologist, a pediatrician, and a general practitioner, all of whom examined the evidence. All of whom came to the conclusion that the bruises on the thighs of the little girl were caused by horseback riding. Now, I cleared that man, and I dropped charges, but the pressure on my office was horrendous. Mr. Vance had this problem with Dominic Strauss-Kahn. It was a hot button item. And he examined the facts, and he knew that Mr. Strauss-Kahn was not guilty, and therefore he dropped the charges. Well, they're also the kind of pressure that you have. I understand why we're not trying to push junk science on this guy. We laid out the evidence, and we gave him a video, and we said, now here, study this stuff, and what can we do? And we'll bring in experts who will confer with you, and they're including witnesses from the fire department in New York City and so on, that will satisfy you the legitimacy of this thing. But of course, they didn't want to get involved because they knew that if they did, it would be too hot to touch. This is whoever was behind this thing has enormous power. They have enough power to orchestrate a news media covered up. Remember the morning of 9/11? There was a kind of how the news media, all the major news media in the country, were marching in lockstep. This is Osama bin Laden, and the 19 suicidal fanatics and Al-Qaeda and so on and so forth. We never heard. There was no mention of the way that these buildings came down, which was immediately suspicious. Somebody who had to have control of the press. They have to have enough power to make it known to the state prosecutor that he better not touch this, otherwise his career is going to be in trouble. These are enormously, and you have to think about the power that you'd have to have in order to have access to these three buildings and be able to finance and direct the planting of military-grade explosive and incendiary agents strategically throughout these buildings. Think of the enormous amount of power that you'd have to have. And what we're doing here is simply laying down an historical record, because sometime after I'm through, I'm now 73, and I'm not going to be in the saddle much longer. But eventually there's going to be another generation, a new generation coming up, but we will have established an historical record. And once from these historical footprints, as it were, this historical record, they will be able to deduce who it was and come to a pretty good conclusion. It's just like now, 50 years after the death of Kennedy, we can say a lot more about who the culprits were behind his murder than we could at the time, because we've had, first, time has passed, more evidence has come into place. We've also been able to take a dispassionate look that the passing of time permits. And I think that this is going to happen. I have no doubt that who was really behind the murder of Kennedy? I'm quite sure that Jerry Corsi's book puts he's right. I think in the same way we're going to be able to deduce who was the murderer, who were the culprits that planted the explosives in these buildings and made them come down the way they did. And eventually it will not, as time passes on, the cognitive dissonance passes away. Historical responsibility will compensate for lack of legal responsibility. And I have no doubt that as long as we do our part in our time of laying down a proper historical record, people will see in the next generation, after I'm dead and gone, they'll be able to look back and see, oh, certainly this was controlled demolition, and they will be able, by taking a look at the circumstantial evidence, to deduce who it was.
Now, when I think of justice, I think of that statue with the woman holding the scale, and there's a blindfold covering her eyes because justice is supposed to be blind, and that means that regardless of whatever the personal opinions are of the prosecutor, in a perfect world, you want to think that if the evidence shows something, that they will go with it, that they will prosecute it, investigate it. This is with the case with 9/11. But what I'm hearing from you, and the impression I would get if I was coming from another planet or something, and just as a non passionate or disconnected observer, would be that really it depends on not only just on the whims of the prosecutor, but on whoever is behind them, that justice isn't blind, that when something's big...
Blind justice is an ideal. But, I've talked to a lot of young lawyers. They spend all this time and money to get through law school and get admitted to the bar, and then they come to the reality that judges are corrupt and that cases are fixed and on and on and on, and this is a very hard thing for them to accept. Lawyers are oftentimes the last ones that are willing to believe this because they put so much of themselves into becoming lawyers and learning to love the abstract beauty of the law. Well, get into the real world, and we find out otherwise. No, the system is not straight. But let's take, for example, the Dred Scott case. You probably know something about that case. That was decided in 1857 by the United States Supreme Court. And at the time, a lot of people suspected that this case had been fixed. Well, not long ago, Chief Justice Rehnquist wrote a book on the Supreme Court, and he laid out a lot of evidence in that book that shows precisely that the Dred Scott case was fixed by influence peddling of some very powerful politicians of that day that interacted with the judges, and they came up with a corrupt judgment. And, of course, the corrupt judgment was one of the explosive, incendiary items that provoked civil war. And this stuff happens. We have to understand. When I was teaching, I had an idea that wasn't very well received, but I still think it was what should happen. We should teach a course on judicial corruption and how it happens. There are a lot of cases and a lot of material that you can look. You can go back and look at the Dred Scott case today, and you can see exactly how the case was set up and how the judges were fixed and how the political influence was brought to bear. And, of course, a lot of your suspicions based on circumstantial evidence is now confirmed with the revelations of Chief Justice William Rehnquist in his book on the Supreme Court. And we can look at this, but at the time, if you were living at the time, the impact of cognitive dissonance would be very great because lawyers don't want to believe that their system is corrupt, or at least many of them don't, and most of us don't. But with the passing of time, much of the emotional impact of cognitive dissonance passes away, and I have no doubt that whereas Mr. Vance is obviously terrified at the possibility of having to cooperate in getting up a grand jury investigation of 9/11, I have no doubt that in a future generation, after Mr. Vance is retired and maybe dead, we'll be able to look back on this and when the emotional stakes are gone and be able to figure this thing out. The nice thing about what Lord Acton said, historic responsibility must make up for lack of legal responsibility, is that actually historical responsibility does make up for lack of legal responsibility. But it is our task in our time to lay down the historical foundations. And so what I was doing in working with Richard Gage and others in your organization was to help set up an historic record. And the reason why AE 9/11 Truth is so important is that they have done such a splendid job in creating an historical record, and a much more complete historical record that could be laid down, say, for Jack Kennedy's death or even Lincoln's death before that.
All right, for my next clip, who can forget my interview with William Binney, August 28th, 2014. He's an NSA whistleblower, former technical director there at the NSA, and he was a signatory of AE 9/11 Truth's petition calling for a new investigation into the destruction of the Twin Towers in Building 7 on 9/11. We'll listen to him in this clip.
Why do you agree that 9/11, the building destructions in New York, should be reinvestigated?
Primarily because I met some folks here in D.C. who were also involved in 9/11 advocacy for another investigation, and I hadn't really looked closely at that at the time. And when they started pointing out to me all of the observable events that were ongoing, plus some of the evidence that was being assembled, it was very obvious that it seemed to me like all the investigation that had been up to that point was basically sloppy science at best, because it was selectively ignoring basic facts. Now, what I mean by a basic fact is something that's just there that needs to be addressed. Even if they can't explain it, they should have said, we can't explain this, but it's there, so they at least recognized this basic fact that existed. But it seemed to me like what the architects, engineers, I was talking to a physicist and so on about it, that these facts were basically ignored, and it wasn't that they weren't observable, because I saw them on some of the videos that they were showing me and so on, and plus some of the testimony from some of the demolition people who've been looking at this over time. Had made statements like like the fall of Building 7 looked very much like a controlled demolition. Well, when you have people, I'm not an expert in demolitions, but when you have people like that saying those kinds of things, you need to address that in whatever research or investigation you're doing. And here, what you have is an investigation that basically ignored all kinds of basic observable facts that they should have addressed in one way or the other. Even if they couldn't explain it, that's fair enough, as long as they looked at it and said, this happened, we don't know what it means or how to interpret it. That would have been fair. But when you selectively ignore those kinds of things, that's just very sloppy science at best. And so that's why I was suggesting that. That's why I was quite willing to sign the petition of saying we need to really take another look at this and come up and say, hey, these are the real events that occurred,
You have colleagues out there, whether or not you even know them. There might be people at NSA currently listening to this show, or just supporters of yours who followed you and like what you're doing, who may obviously talk out about the NSA, but may not even be aware of the issues surrounding the building destructions in New York on 9/11. If you could talk to them right now, how can they help? What should they be doing to push for just a simple new investigation into the building destructions in New York? What would you have to say to them?
Well, the ones at NSA, they should be pushing to get a reinvestigation, a new 9/11 Commission investigation, because of all the data that was not included in that investigation. Even though Tom Drake personally told the members of that 9/11 Commission this information, they excluded it from their report. So, I mean, all that data is it's like selectively picking what you include as evidence. Well, the same is true here with 9/11 in terms of from what I've seen from the evidence that I've seen personally. Why, it's clear that they're selectively ignoring certain facts or basic evidence, which is what they did in the NSA side in terms of the 9/11 Commission. It was the same parallel kind of approach. So ignore things that are inconvenient for the story you want to tell. So I think from all sides we need a reinvestigation. It's not just the 9/11 side, it's also the intelligence community, all of that, because they've excluded certain information and they shouldn't have.
Right, and something anyone can do. I mean, we have a good guy from the NSA on here who put his name to that petition, and here he is talking about this. We need more folks to put their names to that petition and to talk openly about that, because the more we talk openly about this issue, the less taboo it becomes, the more acceptable it becomes, and the peer pressure mentality dissipates. Now, in our final 2 minutes here, can you just briefly tell me, on the issue of the NSA, which is a result of the post-9/11 world, and the issue with 9/11 and all the issues about the building destructions in New York, do you think we can have positive ends to these kind of national sagas we're going through? Do you think America can still work for the people and we can have justice and restore some normalcy in this country?
Yes, we can, but it's going to take a whole new administration. I mean, you got. There's so many people down in the House and Senate, and also in the leadership anyway, and also in the White House and the agencies and the Department of Justice, who are all have a vested interest in protecting this from becoming public. Because so they're all basically covering up for themselves and trying to justify it amongst themselves. Because if one falls, they feel they all will fall. So it's a matter of protecting everybody and circling the wagons and defending your story. So we need basically new people, a fresh look at this whole thing from the congressional side as well as in the White House. I mean, we need people who will take an honest, hard, investigative look at all of this stuff and start coming out publicly and saying what's going on and being truthful with us, so we can have an informed electorate to be able to make decisions about who should be representing us in D.C.
Okay, this next clip is all the way back from August 10th, 2012, and you're going to hear another voice helping to host this show. Remember, Bernie Suarez was originally my partner on this show, he used to host it with me, and we were interviewing on the show Jonathan Cole. And this is where the Santa Claus analogy, I've referred to this many times here on this program, originally came from when he spoke about it here on 9/11 Free Fall. So sit and listen.
Before we get into all that, I know, give us your take on 9/11. I know you wanted, we want to get your take. You have an analogy that you want to share, a Santa Claus analogy.
Sure. I look at 9/11. I kind of, when I've done some talks in front of some other folks out there, and I start off and I say, I want you to think back in your life, way back when we were all just children. We're 4 and we're 5 years old. Okay, the three of us are on the playground. Actually, there's a whole group of kids on the playground. And it's December, and guess what's coming up? Christmas. And all the kids are all happy and excited because we're all talking about what we're going to get from Santa Claus. And I come walking up to the group that's all excited, and I say, I don't think Santa exists. And the reason I don't think Santa exists is because I know that reindeers can't fly. And because reindeers can't fly, then the entire story falls apart. And they all sort of look at me and they say, well, that's totally ridiculous. For crying out loud, I've sat in Santa's lap. She sat in Santa's lap. What is he, an imposter or something? When I ask my parents, they say he's real. When you ask your parents, they say he's real. If you ask any adult anywhere, any 5-year-old asks an adult, they're going to say, of course he's real. Not only that, all the media talks about, we have Christmas stories and we have movies about Santa. And even NORAD tracks him on Christmas Eve. We can watch him as NORAD tracks him. So what are you telling me? What are you telling me? That do all the parents and all the authorities, the media and the government all have some sort of secret meetings and decide to lie to all us millions of kids? That would be impossible. Somebody would have talked. And besides, who would come up with such a scheme? And why would they do it? And so I tell all the other kids, I say, you know what? I can't answer the who and the how and why they would do it. I just don't know. But I do know that the laws of physics say that reindeers can't fly, and therefore the official story has got to be wrong. But all the other kids, of course, ignore me, and because what I have to say certainly isn't fun. It's kind of a downer. And because they believe that somebody would have talked trumps my physics of the reindeers flying. And so they say, well, I must just be a crazy conspiracy theorist, and I probably don't think we landed on the moon. And besides, even talking about this is sort of scary. So they just ignore me, and they laugh, and they go about their life having fun on the playground. And 9/11, in my opinion, is very similar to this analogy in that you can show people the science and you can show them the physics, but they just still use the, well, somebody would have talked response, or well, that just can't be true because it goes against my beliefs. Your physics goes against my beliefs. So that's my little analogy that I use about 9/11.
All right, finally, I have a great last clip to play. This is from the last question of an interview I did with Jerry B. from Scotland. He's a researcher, part of that team that found out that NIST had left out critical features of Building 7's design that would have prevented their collapse hypothesis from happening. They did that through Freedom of Information Act request, and we were talking about the concept of maladministration throughout that interview and the fact that in other countries, officials can actually be held accountable when they screw up in the level that NIST has. Whether you want to call it screw up or cover up, I guess history is going to decide that after we get a real investigation. But I wanted to leave everybody with this thought, and I like the simple way that Jerry makes his point here. So here you go.
Now, in our last minute here, because we are running out of time, you talk about people standing up, people doing something. What do you think? What are things people can do, either every day or big things ordinary citizens around the world can accomplish and do to impact the 9/11 Truth movement?
I think you have to do what you can, and nobody, no one person can maybe take on this issue and win, but together, and I think with a variation in efforts and types of efforts, people need to innovate in the way that we communicate with people. We need to use all kinds of look at Lupe Fiasco mentioned 9/11 Building 7. Did they really pull it? And what was it? Words I never said. How many people did he communicate just Building 7 to in that? Look at the Corbett video, 9/11 in 5 minutes, which uses humour to get the message over. So we need to innovate, and we need to get the message over in a way that isn't entirely negative. It's very hard to sell a negative message to somebody. I think in some way we have to laugh. We have to be able to apply humour. We have to be able to look at music. We have to look at videos. YouTube's an absolutely great place for being able to put your ideas out there to the world. And certainly the mainstream media, aren't going to do their job for us. So we have to become the mainstream media ourselves.
And I forgot to mention that interview with Jerry B. was from August 1st, 2013, exactly 1 year before Richard Gage was on C-SPAN's Washington Journal, so woohoo. All right, I hope everyone's enjoyed this trip down memory lane. Keep listening into this show. We're going to have some great guests coming up in the next few weeks. Remember, this program's on every Thursday night on No Lies Radio at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific. You can also download MP3s of the show from the Internet Archive by going to 911freefall.com. This is Andy Steele saying have a great week and good luck.